Hey everybody, it's Chris. This is part 2 of our movement Q&A. Part 1 was entirely from our patrons. This one comes from several places, including YouTube and Instagram, but mostly from our Proven Plan group chat. And if you're unfamiliar with our Proven Plans, it's a comprehensive system of training plans for both boulders and sport climbers. And there are training plans that start at beginner, which are our Just Climb More plans, and then you can follow that system all the way to bouldering double digits or looking to climb your first 514 or solidify at the 514 grade. Thousands of climbers have used these plans. They're regularly updated as we learn more about training for climbing, and they'll likely be updated again soon with both resource libraries discussing tactics, giving training and performance tips, with more robust strength training sessions, and with what I've learned in this multi-month exploration of movement. So be on the lookout for that. You can find the links to the Proven Plans in the show notes if you're looking for a simple way to get started training without having to do all of the homework and build your own plan. I think this is the best system of training plans out there in the world, period. I don't think there's anything that even comes close. And you can find that link to the Proven Plans in the show notes. Last thing I want to mention here before we get started is that I've been building a tool that will help you assess where in your movement skills you should begin work on improving. Much like strength training, I think movement is something that you'll always be refining and improving. It should always be a part of your general climbing training and practice. So having a good guide on what elements of movement to spend time on is something that climbing is missing. And I'll have that ready for the first group of folks to check out within the month. So if you want to be notified when that's rolling out and be part of the first group to see it and go through the assessment and get advice about it, you can be notified by signing up at link.powercompanyclimbing.com/move, or that link's going to be at the top of the show notes for you, so you can click it directly from in there. Okay, let's get into it. All right, this time around we had quite a few questions that overlap in really interesting ways. So we're going to start with a combo question from YouTube and from our Proven Plan group. And from YouTube, at Billy44Talent says, this might be a hard topic to cover, but I'm interested in the puzzle-solving aspect of how to make a move work. Right now, I use a combination of intuition, trial and error, and video to try to determine why I fall. However, this can narrow my view, and I sometimes end up following a dead end in terms of beta. As an extreme example, I convinced myself I needed to cut feet for a move on the moonboard. A few months of failure and coming back later, I finally discovered I could do the move without cutting feet, and it was much less demanding strength-wise. I certainly could have sent this climb earlier had I had a better framework for discovering beta. And from our Proven Plan group, Lyra Goldberg asks, how to efficiently figure out your own beta when there are several options. And I think the best answer here in both cases is exploration. I wish that I could give a framework, and maybe we will come up with that, go down that path. I'm going to be exploring tactics next after I wrap up this movement exploration. So maybe I'll come across a good way or develop a good framework for considering beta. But I think that every climb is so different that the one overarching thing you should keep in mind and that you should ask yourself first is, have you tried everything, even the ridiculous things. Have you tried those? And particularly when you're a newer climber, this is really important. We tend to just stick with the first way that works. I often see people do this and then never explore further. And it might seem like, or it might even be true, that exploring new methods will end up taking you longer to send that one boulder. It doesn't always mean that, though. Let's be clear here. But exploring new methods will nearly always help you become a more skillful climber faster. So especially for new climbers, I think even if you can do the boulder right now, even if you can do the route right now, why not, if you've already fallen, why not work out new methods? Why not look for every possible method right there? It's just going to make you a better climber, a climber who can not only spot more options faster, but also execute those options faster and better understand what works for you. And the key here is to understand what works for us, what works best for us. But we also have to understand what doesn't work for us. That's part of understanding what does work for us. And to do that, we have to try things that don't end up working. Whether it seemed ridiculous, whether it seems like it's going to work, try it regardless. And I would do this early. Whether you're a new climber, whether you're a seasoned veteran, I would do this early in the process. Instead of waiting for that moment when you're 5 days or 5 weeks or 5 months into trying something and whatever you're trying isn't working. And then you finally, instead of constantly saying, oh, I could send next try if I get lucky, instead of doing that, you explore other options. And then all of a sudden you find something easier and you do it quickly, and you're having the same sentiment that Billy is of, I could have sent this thing months ago had I had a better framework for trying different things. And I think, like I said, that has to happen early. Even if you're doing the things, even if you're doing the moves, look for other options. Do that early in the process, and you won't get stuck in this drawn out campaign. And Billy, in your example with a big move that you didn't realize you could do without cutting feet, the key now is to not make that mistake again. You've got that data point now. So pretty much anytime you come across a big move from here on out, whether you're keeping feet on or cutting feet, whichever way works first, explore the other option immediately. If you have to, get a power spot into the position to see if you can actually keep your feet on, or try jumping a few times to see if it feels more efficient. Oftentimes, the momentum that carries over from a jump, if you're good at using it, can save you a lot of energy. It can take a lot of tension to keep your feet on, to move them after big moves. And I'll also say this. The only way to know what beta is going to work best for you is to build awareness. And that will help you know when to look for other options, or if the option you already have is good enough, which frees you up to look elsewhere on the climb for more efficiencies you can improve. And that is just going to require time spent being intentional and reflective. I don't think there's a substitute for that. All right, next question, Lyra Goldberg. Again, how to differentiate between when the issue is a lack of strength versus using the wrong movement. And I do think this is a really great question. I went pretty in-depth on this in part 1. So Lyra, I'm going to refer you back to part 1 if you haven't listened to that yet. Right around 25 minutes, I believe, is when I get into this. It's a tough thing to do because strength and movement are always wrapped up in each other. But I think the answer I gave will be a good one. So go check that out, around 25 minutes in part 1. Lyra also asks, and there are several questions here. We've got a few related questions. how to identify what the right beta would be in a situation, toe hook versus heel hook, she gives as an example. And for me, the answer is just try them both. Try them both quite a few times. Oftentimes, both will work. So I'm not sure there is a right beta. But if you're regularly exploring both answers, then over time, you'll get better at recognizing when a particular distance or orientation or size of foothold will work better for which technique. And even then, once you think you've mastered that, I think we still have to keep trying both, because as you improve your skill at both techniques, when they work is going to change. So I think we have to constantly be exploring solutions and reassessing what's best for us. There's just no substitute for exploration, period. The next two sort of related questions here are from Instagram. Lauren at Good Spray Coaching, do you have any tips for virtually coaching or developing toe hook skills? And at Kane Nathaniel Kane, toe hooks, how to generate movement, cues, best practices. They've always felt mysterious. I have a lot to say here. This whole episode could just become a toe hook pro clinic. I'm not going to let it go quite that far, but I do have a lot to say, because toe hooks are a superpower of mine, and a superpower that I developed once I realized I didn't know a lot about toe hooks. And I came across that because on a route that I was trying, I lucked into a toe hook. And then once I explored it, it helped so much in the crux. And I hadn't seen or heard anyone else talk about this toe hook that I thought, how many toe hooks have I missed in my climbing career that could have helped me out? So I spent an entire summer in the gym exploring toe hooks. In all of their iterations, I set them. I tried to climb boulders that weren't toe hook boulders with toe hooks. I explored toe hooks versus heel hooks in a lot of different situations. And something I'm seeing now, and this is part of what that movement assessment I'm working on is that I spend a lot of time on two elements of toe hooks that are really important: tension and position. What works, what doesn't work, what barely works, what can I improve at? And I just kept playing all summer long with toe hooks. And I think there's one major thing that's been missed in almost every post or conversation that I've seen about them. There's tons of info out there on like the normal places we go first, like strengthening, which frankly I don't think is necessary for most people, at least at the like lowest level coming into toe hooks. There's lots of information about how to place a toe hook. And frankly, anytime there's blanket advice about how to orient yourself for any specific technique, I stop paying attention. And you should take that with a shaker full of salt, because it's just not always the case. Will never be for any technique always the case. I've seen advice out there about how straight or bent your leg should be. Silly. Ignore that. There is no blanket advice about how to place a toe hook. And here's the one major thing that's nearly always missing from the conversation, which also calls back to Lyra's question about heel hooking versus toe hooking. Heel hooking, I believe, falls pretty evenly into two categories: heel hooks that you use to pull you into a better position, and heel hooks that you use to lock you in place in order to move your upper body. And toe hooks most often fall into that latter category, the lock your lower body in place while you move your upper body category. You're rarely using a toe hook to actively pull the rest of your body anywhere, especially at the lower levels of toe hooks. In fact, I'd say more often than you're pulling yourself with a toe hook, you're lowering yourself out with a toe hook. very often by locking your lower body in place and then lowering your upper body into a different situation. Now, that doesn't mean that toe hooks are passive. Very often, there'll be a lot of tension around the hip and the glutes to keep the right amount of tension on the toe. Essentially, toe hooks and heel hooks in a lot of cases, but toe hooks especially, are acting exactly the way a hand does when you're climbing in compression. So I view, in a lot of cases, a toe hook as a third arm that's going to hold me in place while I move my upper body somewhere else. And I'm not against strengthening for this. I think, there's a lot of advice out there about strengthening the tibialis anterior. Sure, if you want to do that, go ahead. I'm never against more strength. But I'd also be willing to bet that 99% of the time, that's not the answer to making it work, especially in the moment, like I talked about a lot in part 1 of this Q&A. And as for placement, you have to experiment. There's no other way. You have to experiment and build your knowledge of how toe hooks work and what you're capable of. There are very subtle toe hooks, same as there are very subtle heel hooks. And these aren't always necessarily harder than the obvious ones. They're just different. And finally, don't avoid using them on the easier climbs. This is a mistake I see quite a bit. When it's a big, juggy thing in the gym, you can often skip the toe hook. You'll find an easier way around the toe hook. Don't do that. Learn to use them in that arena so that you have more information when you encounter them on something hard. And when you encounter them on something hard, don't say, this is just wizardry, and move on, because this is an opportunity. Practice the things that are hard for you. Always. That's the best way to make toe hooks not seem mysterious, is to practice them in lots of different environments and terrains. See when they work best for you. See where a toe hook is most often positioned on lightly overhanging terrain versus on a roof. What did they look like in a roof or on a really steep wall versus on a less steep wall? There's so many different types of toe hook. I think you just have to practice it. And again, I'll say this, I said this earlier, but you have to know what doesn't work in order to know what does work. So just because you're practicing a thing and it doesn't work, that's not a failed experiment. That's a data point on what doesn't work, which then gives you a little more clarity on what does work. And to address Lauren's question here about how to do it virtually, I'm really a firm believer in that creating a training or practice environment or expectation for the client of exploration is valued over the send. In this part of your training day or practice day that you're working on a skill, exploration should be valued over the send every single time you pull onto the wall, period. And I'm of the opinion that especially virtually, where there isn't a constant back and forth during practice, that telling someone that there are detailed, specific mechanics to a move, that's a mistake. A lot of people want that. They want the arrows and the angles drawn over their videos or whatever. But I think that's an error. I don't think we can say this is what makes it work, unless maybe you're looking at a video of that person failing on a thing that they've succeeded on 100 times, and you've seen the videos of 100 times, and now they're failing and they don't know why. Maybe then you can say that. But there's so much variation in the movements we do that I just don't think there are specific mechanics to any single move, especially when you're trying to apply it to a different boulder or a different route. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't common things to explore. And I think in your drill that you're building and your advice that you're giving to your client, you can give them these common things with the caveat of you have to explore these. These might be the wrong answers, and that's okay. Finding the wrong answers frees us up to know where to look for the right answers. And those common things with toe hooks might be the upper-lower body separation of sorts that I mentioned, locking the lower body into place, moving the upper body. And it's not often with toe hooks that you're moving the lower body, at least the leg that's toe hooking. You might use that other leg to post up on something to advance your upper body when you're in the toe hook. And in this case, even the absolute worst feet will work. Smearing on an overhanging wall works quite well if you lever your body into position to make that smear work. And I think you'll do that by exploring it if you're exploring with intention. We can't say this is the exact angle you want to post up on. That's never going to work. But you can give the advice of maybe try posting your other leg up on something in order to move the upper body up. Think of that toe like you would a hand in compression to squeeze between the toe hook and what other handhold that you have. But like I said, there's very little detail that applies to every toe hook. Instead, exploration is the way. And last thing I'll say here, Lauren, and I know that you're already good at this, but I just want to iterate it for any other coaches listening out there. As a coach, you should model that in your approach. That exploration is the way. You should model that. Saying, I don't know, what if we try this, is a good practice if you want your athletes to also be willing to explore. If you always have the answer, the athletes expect that they should always have the answer. And I don't think that's a great way to help climbers build skill. Okay, moving on here. I am absolutely going to say your name wrong, but I'm going to try it. It's either Vasily or Vasily, not sure which, Ivanov. How do you know that you're improving certain areas of movement, i.e. climbing with the right momentum to save energy on flash attempts? Any way to track it yourself beyond doing it on a climb you've already done before? Personally, I feel that I'm improving after incorporating some dynamic climbing as part of my warm-up, but when I try a new problem somewhat closer to my limit, I do not feel fluid or efficient on flash attempts. There's actually a lot of interesting stuff here, and I want to start out by pointing out that you're falling into a comparison trap here, a common comparison trap that lots of climbers fall into. And that's that you're comparing how you climb on limit flash attempts to things that you have dialed in your warm-ups. And that's just impossible. Your climbing is going to be entirely different. Everyone's is. We can look at quite possibly the best on-site flash climber on the planet, Adam Ondra. His on-sighting, if we're looking at it from the outside, looks like he's just as in control or dialed in as he is on Red Point. But if we listen to his voiceovers and pick out the things that he's saying about how he felt in that moment, we can find all sorts of things that he would not feel on warm-ups or on dialed in Red Points. He's just gotten good at looking like he's in control, keeping his composure even when it's starting to fall apart. So I think we have to be careful to make sure we're comparing how we feel on hard flashes to how we feel on other hard flashes, and Red Points to Red Points, and warm-ups to warm-ups. Hard flashes are just always going to be more uncomfortable. I don't think there's a way to compare those things. But to make sure you're moving these skills that you're practicing in your warm-ups to harder things, you have to gradually continue trying the skills on harder things. You have to keep it at a slightly uncomfortable level. So for instance, I very intentionally make up boulders that test the skills I'm working on at a moderate level or a mini project level and then a limit level. I try to move it through all of those levels for me. Recently, I had a moment outdoors on a 13A mini project. It took me 6 or 7 tries or something, including some warm-up bolt-to-bolt burns. And on this climb, I had sorted out the crux using beta that for me would have been an extreme weakness just a few years ago. And the interesting thing here is that there were other methods. The first way I did the crux was a different method that would have suited me better a couple of years earlier, and still, frankly, suited my strengths better. But it wasn't as efficient a solution as this way that I never would have chosen 2 or 3 years ago. But because I've been putting time in, practicing, both climbing in full crimp as well as getting in really small little boxes, because I've been practicing that solution presented itself to me, and I was able to make use of it better than the lerpy, slightly more dynamic way that I probably would have done a few years ago. And that was the first really tangible evidence I had that I'd moved these skills into my immediately available vocabulary without intentionally making up something to fit them. And that took a few years. That's not an instant thing. You have to stay the course. You have to continue practicing these skills at higher and higher levels of climbing. They're not going to translate very well for most people if you only ever practice them at warm-up level. You have to be intentionally considering them at higher levels. And in your question here, you mention any way to track it yourself beyond doing it on a climb you've already done before. I actually don't think that's a good way to track skill. Simply because, and you alluded to this, choreographing a movement is different than being proficient at employing it quickly in any other scenario. So I think you just have to gather data points over time. I know that's not the great, like, I want to check this box and here's how I check it answer. But I think that is the answer, is you do it over time by intentionally exploring that skill in various scenarios at various levels of difficulty. Next question from Vasily here, and he's got a bunch of great ones, so I'm including them all here, assuming my voice doesn't give out on me before I get to the end of this. Next question, how to choose the right grade effort level for deliberate movement practice. I talked about this a little just then, but the real answer here is you find where you're uncomfortable, but not where you're overwhelmed. And we can't think of this in terms of grades. We have to do it in terms of difficulty for us in that movement. You might find an easy grade for you with a move you don't understand or feel uncomfortable on. And that's a fantastic opportunity because it allows you to focus on the difficulty you need to learn there instead of just the difficulty of the problem. So the answer is find where you're uncomfortable, but not overwhelmed. Next one from Vasily, how to best understand which movement areas are the biggest limiting factors for you, i.e. footwork, foot swaps versus body position versus right use of hips and momentum, etc. And there is not a good way. I talked about that in the intro to this. There really is not a good way currently. That's why I'm working on this movement assessment, so that we have a better guide of how to work on movement, which parts of movement to be working on. I think we have we have a really great tool available in gyms with setters who are intentionally giving you problems to solve that will move you to the next level. That's a really valuable resource to have. And if we intentionally approach those problems in the right way, I think we have all the tools we need to continue improving our movement over time. And that's what this assessment tool is going to help you figure out, where to put your intention when you're climbing on boulders or roots or whatever. Like I said, there's a link in the show notes right there at the top for you to sign up to be one of the first people notified when this thing is ready. And I'm not going to put it out to the public for a while. It's going to go out to the select group of people who want the information and want this assessment and are willing to give some feedback, let me know what they think, and then we can make some changes to it over time. But if you want to be the first, there's a link right there. Next up, Vasily again, couple more from him. Any tips on how to improve pacing on both boulders and sport routes and find a way of switching between different tempos while on a route or on a boulder that works for you best? And I'm really glad you asked this because I think it's the most overlooked piece of movement. It's one of what I consider to be the 5 atomic elements, the very base foundational level elements. But it's one that's always in play in every single move, every single route, every single boulder. And I have plans to make a video about this very soon. It's not made yet, but it will be. So stay tuned for that. If you're not subscribed to the YouTube, you should definitely go do that. I think of pacing and what I consider to be this foundational element, rhythm, a little bit differently. And it seems like you're asking about both. Tempo, which you mentioned here, is rhythm. That's the rhythm that we're moving at. While pacing is more about the overall strategy you use while climbing. So let's dig into rhythm a little bit first. I think there are 2 different drills that go a long way toward learning to expand the rhythm that you climb in. We all have a normal sort of built-in rhythm that we use. I used to be a really slow, deliberate climber. I've changed that, and now I can climb much, much faster without it getting chaotic. And I think that's the goal of both of these drills, is to find the extremes of slow rhythms and faster rhythms that you can do without it getting chaotic or wildly inefficient. And the first is sloth monkeys. We've talked about these a lot. This is essentially, and I'll link to both of these drills in the show notes, but essentially this is climbing a boulder as slow and controlled as possible. Constant movement. You're not looking to pull into a static position and reach. It's constant, super slow movement like you would imagine a cartoon sloth to be moving. Over-exaggerated. And then the monkey side of the sloth monkeys is the opposite. It's constant movement and trying to utilize your momentum from the prior move to redirect you into the next move, and trying to keep a faster rhythm. This is not trying to climb as fast as possible. It's not trying to get super sloppy, but it's also not being as concerned about being precise and taking everything exactly right. It's more about finding a monkey-like rhythm that uses momentum over and over to get you to the top of the boulder. And now the next drill we call slow is smooth, smooth is fast. You're essentially climbing a boulder several times, speeding it up as you go. So first you're climbing it really slow, almost sloth-like. Next you'll speed that up a little and speed it up again. And as you get to the end, what you should be doing is considering where are the advantages in climbing a little slower and in climbing a little faster and more monkey-like? And can I put those two rhythms together to make each move work the most efficient that it can? I think this is a really fantastic drill for learning when to switch between the two rhythms. And again, the goal here is try to find the extremes without it getting chaotic or wildly inefficient. Now, for switching pacing, which I think is the more strategic way you look at an entire route, I think you have to take a close look at the individual climb you're working on and figure out where the checkpoints are and how much of a pause each checkpoint allows. It might be a full rest, it might just be a chalk and a breath, or it might even be just the checkpoint that you keep moving through, but it allows you and cues you to reset your tempo. Now, if you've practiced those drills, you'll have that skill built to change the rhythm when you need to do so. And you'll have a better understanding of when it's valuable for you to do so. And think of these checkpoints as part of the choreography on a route or on a boulder. When I hit this hold, when I hit this position, that's my cue to switch to a different rhythm for the next two moves. And then when I hit that position, that's my cue to take a breath. Whatever it is, however the choreography works out, make these rhythm switches, these pacing switches, work that into the choreography, same as you do clipping, same as you do chalking up, same as you do taking a breath. All of that has to be worked into the choreography. All right, next one. Any tips on how to get better and more comfortable in coordination boulders if they often feel sketchy and not safe, leading to hesitation, lack of full commitment, and consequently failed attempts? If it's something that is actually dangerous for you, skip it. I'm not a fan of doing hard moves up high in bouldering gyms. But like you allude to here, we have to understand if those moves are hard only because they're high. Is it because we're afraid that they feel hard and they aren't actually hard? Because that's a different thing. In those cases, you decide if it's worth it to you, if it's valuable for you to lean into that. It's totally okay if it's not. But if you decide to try to commit, number one thing for me is talk to a spotter. Check your landings, try to understand where you're going to land, especially if you're outside and you need to shift pads. Get it to a place you're comfortable. I don't care if the other people in your party are not concerned about it and they're willing to just wing off of this thing and land on a single pad that may or may not be placed correctly. If you want a 3-pad layer right there, then before you go, you should build that 3-pad layer, period. And talk to your partners, talk to your spotters about how they can help keep you feeling safer. You can also get power spotted in or use bigger holds to get there, whatever the case is, so that you have more energy when you get there. And for me in those situations, and I have a video on YouTube, an old video about how I deal with this that I'll link here. I give the move a few sort of half commitment attempts, enough that it lets me know a little more about the fall. So it might be just create momentum toward the hold while I'm dropping off. And then it might be touching the hold. And then it might be holding the hold for just a second to see how it affects my position and my trajectory so that I know where I'm going to land. And this just gives me a little more information each time that allows me to fully commit to the boulder or to the move. Same on a sport route. And I think this is where people go wrong. They have half intention when they climb up there. They're hoping for magic. They're hoping it's just going to happen. And they end up trying the same thing again and falling the same way again. And they don't do anything different. And that is a waste of energy. You have to do something different. You have to try to grab the next hold. You have to try different beta. You have to try something a little bit different, a little more commitment. Even just a tiny bit will go a really long way in getting you closer to committing to that move. If you don't change it, like I said, you're wasting your time, you're wasting your energy. It's going to exponentially lengthen the time that it takes you to do this thing, if you're ever able to do it. I see lots of people get totally stuck here. So make sure that's not you. Make a change. Last thing I'll say here is if you can find examples of these moves that you know cause you some concern, whether it's committing to a bad foot or a weird sideways move, or it's a big cross that you don't like, whatever that is, try to find examples of that move closer to the ground, or make up examples of that move closer to the ground. Get better at them there, and you'll have a little more confidence when you get to them up high. And you were specifically asking about coordination boulders. Most gyms have quite a few of those near the ground if they're setting those sorts of boulders. So just make sure you're getting more and more comfortable at those instead of feeling like you have to climb this boulder and send. Like I said earlier in response to Lauren and virtually coaching toe hooks, sending is not the priority when you're trying to learn something. The priority is exploration and learning that skill. So if you're just doing the first halves of boulders, fine. That's great. Okay, last question from Vasily here. Any movement areas that are important to focus on before a bouldering trip versus a sport climbing trip? First off, I'll say that for any trip, you should be adding some pressure into the equation, into your training and your practice before the trip. Pressure is going to change how you move. It's going to rush you in a lot of cases. It's going to mess with your belief in yourself, in your commitment, or in your, it's going to mess with your belief in yourself. And that's going to change the way you're moving. So add in pressure, having to do something in a certain amount of time or attempts can be a really great way to prepare mentally for trips. Now, beyond that, I think the answer depends on the area. Every climbing area has a cheat code of some sort. If you can rest well on like 2-pad mini jugs, you can own the red. If you can learn to get on and wait a foothold at your chest, New River Gorge won't feel so difficult. If you can understand how to really stand on your feet, you can own a lot of granite areas or Smith Rock. If you get more accustomed to climbing on painful holds and they don't hurt you as much, they don't limit you as much, you'll get more reps and more sends in Waco or Bishop. So I'd find out what that cheat code is of that specific area, talk to people, listen to our What, When, How to Train episodes if we have one on that area, or if we don't, suggest an area to us and we'll seek somebody out who knows that area. Whatever that cheat code is, whether it's movement or a particular strength, make that the priority for a few weeks prior to your trip. And I think it will go a long way into translating this training and practice you've been doing over into performing at that particular area. Okay, sort of very loosely related here, and also from our Proven Plan group, from Ethan Suttner, is there value in doing the technical hover drill where you hover the moving hand over the lower hold before it moves to the upper hold, instead of the popular method, which is hovering over the hold that you're going to? I recently made a video all about this. I will link that in the description as well. If you can find and identify what I call the advantageous stable starting positions, then finishing moves become much easier to find and much easier to land on. The best way to do this is that drill that you talk about, which I call false starts. And not everybody connects with this drill, and that's fine. I actually think sport climbers often are better at this than boulders initially. They're used to being constantly in search of rests and places to chalk up and stances to clip from. So they spend a lot of time already practicing finding these stable positions, whereas boulders are more used to moving from one move into the next and never having to find a really stable position. So when moves are a little easier, boulders become a little less efficient oftentimes because they're never finding stability. And when moves become harder and harder, it's tougher for sport climbers to continue moving through these unstable positions. I first came up with this drill because I was working with a friend of mine, Taylor, who is a really talented climber. And at the time, he had just sort of come out of the team system. He'd spent a lot of time bouldering. That's definitely where he was his best. And bouldering in the gym, where there are even fewer stable positions often. One day we were in the gym. I was upstairs training, and Taylor's girlfriend at the time, now wife, Sarah, comes up and says, "You've got to come down and tell Taylor he's doing this wrong." And I was like, "What is he doing wrong?" And she's like, the sloth drill, he's doing it wrong. I'm like, "What are you talking about? Taylor climbs 513 and, V11. There's no way he's doing the sloth drill wrong." I'm like, "I'll come down and I'll check." And I come down and I'm watching him, and what he's doing that I hadn't ever noticed before is that he's creating momentum at the start of every single move. So rather than being sloth-like through the whole move, he creates a little momentum to get started, and then he slows it all down and finishes more sloth-like. And I'm like, how can I put a constraint in place that doesn't allow him to create that momentum every single time he's trying a move? So I came up with this idea of the false start, which is find your position, let go with the hand you're moving, and then try to move slowly out of that position. And he couldn't do it. It took quite a few sessions for him to really dial that in. And once he did, his sport climbing skyrocketed. So it's not a drill everyone needs. It's not a drill everyone is going to connect with at first. But I do think it's a really, really valuable drill. And I said this loosely connects, and here's why. I know that, Ethan, you're doing the 513 trip prep for Wild Iris, and that's a skill at Wild Iris that really comes into play. There are lots of moves, lots of crux moves, and just generally, where you don't get to pair up. You don't get these obvious stable positions. You do a big move, and then without being able to pair up, you have to do another big move immediately. So oftentimes your hand is traveling, 4 feet between holds and between movements. And these are often 2-finger pockets or monos, and you don't get to pair up in those scenarios. So it's a really powerful skill for climbing at Wild Iris. Great question. Next up, from Ryan Kiesel, I think Kiesel. Suggestions for getting back into training for climbing after a long break. Programming considerations for training if you only have access to a moon board or spray wall. And I'm going to answer this from a movement perspective, simply because that's the main focus right now. I would say making sure you're doing plenty of both moves that you like and moves that feel uncomfortable or difficult. And you asked specifically about moon boards versus spray walls. And I think that most gridded boards, like the moon board, are somewhat limited in terms of teaching you how to move. They tend to have a specific style that arises from the grid and the hold types. Nate and I did a conflicted episode for the patrons recently about boards as movement assessment tools, and I'm definitely on the side of not a fan personally. Because, for instance, you can cheat code the moon board by getting really good at keeping low feet until you're extended and then jumping out of that position and then using really high feet for the next move. So if you can hit those two extremes, you can be really good on the moon board. And inside of a normal frame or a normal range, there just aren't as many interesting moves for you to test yourself on. You could make them up, sure, but I don't think most people do that. I think they find the cheat code and then they explore that to its limits. Another gridded board, Kilter, has mostly big holds, so the difficulty has come from getting really athletic. And there's nothing wrong with this. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a limitation to be aware of when we're considering movement. And even a well-set spray wall, which is my choice nearly every time, unless it's adjustable, will be limiting you in terms of angle, which will affect how you move. So I'd say if you can get to other walls, other gyms now and then, that's a big step forward for movement considerations coming back into climbing after you've taken a long break. You've got some skills already from climbing prior. Those skills are going to come back faster. So give yourself the opportunity to bring those skills back by not only climbing on a moon board. Try to mix it up as much as possible. If you're limited to just the moon board, explore moves that don't require that cheat code. You have to be really intentional to do that. You might just be making up your own boulders, but I think that's the best way to go about it. All right, this last one is from Instagram, more of a statement, less of a question, but it's an important statement. And this is from @climbing.coach, Luke Mansfield. Luke, thanks for this. He says, something that always gets me is how footwork is always considered precision and silence, but it's also position and tension. It can dictate the way our hips face, our power in a move, etc. Luke, this is exactly the reason I'm creating this mini course and assessment that I'm working on. And it's not just footwork. We do the same thing with hands and hips and everything else. We focus on the outcome of what happens when we didn't get the main elements correct. And those main elements, I believe, are tension, position, rhythm, commitment, effort. Those 5 things make up every single move we do. They make up all of footwork, whatever that means. They make up toe hooks, heel hooks, drop knees, rose moves, everything. And I think learning that language of the 5 elements, tension, position, rhythm, commitment, effort, is more beneficial to us at the practice and training level rather than leading with technique. If we start with footwork, then I think we're going the wrong direction. We've already skipped over what are the fundamentals of what makes this move work, which are those 5 elements. However, I'm not saying talking in terms of techniques are bad, because during performance, we're always going to lead with techniques and then discuss how we dial things in using the language of these elements. I don't think people are bad at toe hooking. When I worked on toe hooking, I didn't have this language, but I don't think I was bad at toe hooking. I think I gained a better understanding of tension and position through working on toe hooking, and it would have been more efficient for me to go the opposite direction. I think I learned a lot of things about toe hooking that I don't need to know and that I will never use because of the way I explored it. I could have spent half the time and gotten twice the knowledge if I had done this in reverse. I'm just freestyling here, so I know I'm going a mile a minute right now, and maybe this is confusing, but I'm putting it all on paper. I am working on this movement assessment that, like I said in the beginning, like I've said several times here, will be out within the next month. So, and it will make this much more clear. I was initially thinking of it as a complete overhauling of the way we think of movement, but I think it's an overhauling of the way we think of movement in practice. In performance, I think we're doing it the right way, mostly currently. But in practice, where we get better at it, in training, where we improve it, I think we're going about it backwards. All right. Thanks, everybody, for these questions. Both of these episodes, I think, were really great. I'm glad to get to know what you all are thinking about, what holes there are in the content we're putting out there and the way we're teaching people. This is really valuable for me to be considering. So thank you. I'm going to do some more of these probably pretty soon on other topics. In the meantime, go get signed up to learn about that movement course and assessment when it comes out, and check out all the things on the website while you're there, powercompanyclimbing.com. There are so many resources there. Click the resources tab. We've got it all organized into various categories. We've curated collections for you based on these categories. I think it's one of the best collections of resources out there for climbers. So go check that out, and together we can learn, grow, and excel.